Righty-ho, hello everybody. It's transport in the time of COVID-19, and we've now got this YouTube site which Brian has carefully done. Also, you can read the original article there, updates here, and last week's presentation there on YouTube. Okay, quite a lot to get through, but we want to talk about pavement parking, so let's get on with this. Right, if you want a specific set of links or slides, email me on chairrdrf@aol.com. Here's a nice graphic from Changing Gear. You should have read all of the following documents, and don't forget the highway code consultation, which I'll tell you a bit about in a minute. But there are the crucial little things from the logo, from the graphic, no more cyclist dismount. Okay, there are the links. Sorry, it's gear change, not changing gear. You should have all read gear change in detail by now. Also, announcement by the Education Secretary ahead of delivering on the national priority of all children and young people returning to full-time education in September, asking every staff member and student to plan now how they will get to school or college. If it is possible to walk or cycle, please do. Right. Now, the Highway Code Review Consultation document, the Cycling UK has made that easy for you to fill out, but you can personalize it. And what I've been suggesting on Twitter is that you can say something about the fact that it's not reconsidering the recommendation to wear helmets, plus other things. And they have said we're not going to change that or bring in presumed liability. But of course, that's different because presumed liability is actually a law change, whereas changing the recommendation to wear a cycle helmet in the highway code to consider wearing a bicycle crash helmet wouldn't actually be that fundamental a change. So I think you can do some kind of personalizing. I'll try and put that up on the RDRF website in the next month or so, but something to consider. And on that theme, there it is. On that theme, there's someone called Liam Gallagher, who I understand was part of a popular music group, so my young friends tell me, and he is quoted as saying, "The only downside of cycling is the something helmet, but what you gonna do?" Well, you could not wear a helmet, but of course, he does a lot of mountain biking. There is actually something rather interesting about Gallagher from a transport policy point of view. When he was in the early 90s, when he was getting loads of money in, he bought some kind of car for £110,000 despite not having a driving license. And then he never actually got a driving license because he figured out that people in his family and others would be asking him to drive them around. So he decided to not get a driving license. I think that's a pretty interesting bit of transport policy theory there. Well done, Mr. Gallagher. And again, on the highway code, the main thing is about putting in the hierarchy of responsibility, and the wonderful Dave Walker did a cartoon on that for Cycling UK. Greater power should bring greater responsibility. So the greatest power is there. Now, I had a bit of a very friendly discussion with him on Twitter saying, yeah, wouldn't it be a good idea to kind of invert that to show kind of like the motorized are on the backs of the people walking and cycling? And he said, well, yeah, but it, doesn't fit in with the theme of talking about the highway code. But some other people, I think Two-Wheeled Wolf, said that we've had that kind of hierarchy of importance put that way. The prioritizing sustainable transport, they're walking and wheeling at the top, then cycling, public transport, etc. And we're quite used to that with walking and cycling being at the top of what should be our hierarchy. Okay, here's a survey from government, concern about climate change, a few surveys here. Concern about climate change just reached a record high in the UK, which is very good. There it is. The concerned lot have gone up and the not concerned have gone down. And in another survey, 20% said they would consider cycling to work. Right, now here are the fairly dire walking and cycling DFT stats for 2019. Basically, I mean, this is all pre-COVID, but showing it's the same old rumbling along. Annual walking activity decreased in 2019. The average number of miles cycled per person decreased in 2019, but has generally increased since 2002. But the number of trips and stages has remained more or less the same. 2/3 of adults feel that it's too dangerous to cycle on the roads. That's gone up to 66% from 61% the year before. And you should read an interview that Peter Walker has with the minister, Mr. Heaton Harris, who was talking about how he wanted the prescribing cycling to be pushed forward in disadvantaged communities. Nothing about more infrastructure or other forms of support for disadvantaged communities. And there we go again, less than half of children usually walk or cycle to school. There's a paper come out from the wonderful Adrian Davis, Professor of Transport and Public Health at Napier University. He said that school streets can improve the number of children walking, cycling, wheeling to school, and an increase in school street closures would also not result in traffic displacement. So that's the report. He's actually going to figure with Silvia Gautreau, who's presented on school streets here, in a couple of webinars, webinar run by Landor. So look out for that. The next big problem is planning for the future. The new ripping up of planning regulations. Is Phil Jones saying, single point of access cul-de-sac bounded on one side by a major road, skinny, unpaved and unsurveilled footpath linked to street on north, no cycle facilities. Beauty is not just about the architecture. So that's the next big one we've got to deal with. Now, I do look at Twitter and you'll see an awful lot of crap. But what's quite good about this is that there are so many people on Twitter who weigh in and just don't let them get away with it. So here's one example from Surrey Matters. I mean, look at this, the state of it. Cyclists, please put your brain in gear, rather patronizing, offensive. The big bike race is cancelled, so the roads won't be closed and there are no special safety measures in place, which is always the case. And then don't put lives at risk. You know, again, that's the killer cyclists, right? So a load of people weighing in on that. That's a Twitter account from Surrey County Council. Now here's one from South Derbyshire Active Schools Programme. You can just see someone there teaching bikeability to a kid cycling in the gutter with his high-vis and helmet on an empty street. And a lot of people weighed in and said he's in the wrong position, and why does he have to wear a high-vis and all that? And they had a follow-up tweet saying, no, the instructor was telling he the primary position. But anyway, so people weighing in, and at least we're making them feel a bit defensive. I still think there's a lot of delay. Inspectorate and Active Travel England Commissioner hasn't been appointed, and there's delay in when schemes start, when they're completed, and so on and so on and so on. Oh. So now, Local Transport Today did an interview with Department for Transport. I'm not sure if this is brings in anything fundamentally new, apart from just look at some of the things I've highlighted in red. It's saying, you know, what active travel England will be, extensive role promoting best practice, advising, blah, 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 blah. And it's saying that it will hold a cycling budget, and as we hoped and thought, refuse any funding applications that are not compliant with the new National Cycle Design Standards, LTN 120. And the organisation will be a statutory consultee. That's important. Statutory within the planning system, pressing for cycling and walking provision in all developments over a certain threshold. What does that for certain threshold mean? From next year, the organisation will begin to inspect and publish annual reports on highway authorities, whether or not they have received funding from the DFT. Council performance will be graded. It is our intention that the Commissioner Inspectorate will in this regard perform a similar role to Ofsted from the 1990s onwards in raising standards and challenging failure. The assessments will influence the funding Council receive not only for active travel, but for other forms of transport too. Goody. And there was a bit of sloppy journalism from Zoe Williams, who used to write for the London Cycling Campaign's magazine on the low traffic neighbourhood in her borough in Lambeth, and about how there hadn't been any consultation supposedly, and it was all terrible. Okay, so some notes on diversity issues here. I mentioned this last week. Previous presentations include Lucy on street design women and Isabel Clément on disabilities. Lucy's just done another one for LCC on school kids and school travel, school streets, etc. Rachel Aldred, who you know, we can now call Professor, because that's what she is, has done work on intersectionality. If you look at the Railton Low Traffic Neighbourhood Twitter feed for their discussions of impacts on traffic, on BAME communities, Sarah Galligan, who should be here today, will be doing some work with a Black women's group on cycling in the USA. Fozia Nassim and Hop On in Bradford, that's a group of Asian women there. Ruth Mayorkas mentioned Asian Women's Cycling Group, supported by London Borough of Hounslow. Back in the day at Ealing, I funded a weekly group ride for Asian women in Southall. Family by Cycle can talk about children getting involved. There's something about the Muslim community in Stanmore there. And there's something from the Black Cyclists Network about the Black Unity bike ride. A little photo will come up. That was held recently, I'm not sure where. And there's a new Sustrans report with regard to diversity called Cycling for Everyone, or it's advice for councils on cycling for everyone. And there is the Black Unity bike ride. Okay, the top, Repeat Transport Action Network, challenging the government on road building plans. And a very important article was produced last week. This is your must read, by Professor Phil Goodwin on how the Department for Transport is eliminating opposition to road building programs on climate change. That's to say, when there is opposition on climate change grounds, the DFT has got a way of scoring it to make sure you can't oppose the road building. And he says emissions arising as a result of the scheme represent less than 0.1% of total greenhouse gas emissions in any 5-year carbon budget in which they arise. Therefore, the greenhouse gas impact of the scheme would not have a material impact on carbon reduction targets as set by the UK government. Well, obviously, a single road building project won't go over 0.1%. So, I mean, as a whole, the £27 billion will, but not a single one. So that's how the DFT avoid the tricky business of climate change when it comes to road building programs. But do read the article. It looks a bit technical, but it's not too difficult. You should be able to understand it. Do read it. There's a graphic from someone called Robert Burns on traffic evaporation. It's actually based on a low traffic neighborhood in Oxfordshire, I think. But do look at his Twitter feed for the basis of it, and it's an interesting little graphic. I always mention the comprehensive spending review to bump up the 2 billion for active travel, and you can now have your say by going to that link and say, yes, we want more money for active travel, you know, at least twice, if not 3 or 4 times. So that's important. Okay, now on the ground, it all depends where you live. Same thing. Depends how committed the council is. Kent have just introduced their first wave of walking and cycling plans. It's quite a lot there. It looks quite impressive, but it was only announced on the 7th of August, which is when they were due to send in the last date for their sending in for the second tranche. And it was pointed out at the end, they talk about vegetation clearance on footpaths, which is not what the famous letter from Mr. Furness said. I'm not quite as cynical about it as some other people are, because it's, you know, that's probably a small amount of money and there's lots of more impressive stuff. Now in Northamptonshire, Family Bicycle have said, we are questioning a significant chunk of Northamptonshire's spend, which seem to have already been planned. Bus lane ANPR, cycle counters. Meanwhile, nothing has been delivered on the 20 kilometres of infrastructure in the bid, and not a single school street, also expressed in the Tranche 1 bid. Leeds is a system called the Hedgerow Fly-Through, designed a while ago. I've had a look at it. I'm not particularly impressed about the graphics, but it's up to the people in Leeds about what they think about it. And Tim Morton said last week, Glasgow Council won't be able to remove the temporary measures unless such moves are fully consulted on. Okay, and Mark said last week, the Brighton seafront west of Palace Pier will have a segregated cycle lane, or light segregated cycle lane of 4 kilometres going in. Newcastle, this is by I showed you the picture of Grey Street last week, and here's a thumbs up for it from the new Theatre Royal, saying the hugely improved ambience will benefit all the businesses, ourselves included, by the increased footfall that will follow from making this road safer and more pleasant. Always good to get those positive statements from mainstream establishments. And there's going to be a closure of certain roads and bridges, which will be in place from the 13th of August. Also Newcastle. Now, here's Worcestershire. This came up today. Here's a graphic. Active travel in Worcestershire. has made it clear the following red lines apply in terms of schemes which can be supported by current administration. No loss of car parking spaces will be accepted, and no loss of road space will be accepted. Now, the whole point about the instructions was you will get significant road space reallocation. So I would hope there's going to be a lot of clawing back and all the rest of it, and telling off of Worcestershire by the Conservative government. So that's important. Exeter. Now, there was a good article in the Exeter Observer. They said that the council has abandoned the temporary cycling and walking safety plans in Exeter city centre as apparently traders opposed it, and the proposed Topsham changes were also dropped after a snap poll. And they say a 7-day public consultation concerning these proposals was held in the form of a snap poll. This then informed a decision not to proceed with the changes. The results of the poll were removed after it concluded and are no longer available in the public domain. So nice bit of reporting there from the Exeter Observer. Hertfordshire is Welwyn Gardens City as a new temporary cycle lane, and they're going to be bollards going up there somewhere. Doncaster, right. Now, Doncaster, the council have put on Facebook what they've been doing with their Transforming Cities Fund. And here is their off carriageway cycle lane. And I'm speaking as an old style vehicular cyclist. I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, hang on, what's happening at junctions like that? Is Mr. Deegan upset with that layout there? I hope so, because here you've got give way. There's no indication to people coming out that there are going to be cyclists going over there. There's no indication from if this guy wanted to turn in left there that there are going to be cyclists coming across. There's no kind of raising of anything there. There's no indications. It's just looks pretty terrible to me. I may be wrong. Do let me know. Okay, Salford. I put this up last week. There's a nice low traffic neighborhood with lovely sign, and I was informed it had been photoshopped. I was traumatized. So I've since heard that you can actually buy these signs from that site and get real ones. And that'd be nice to put them on planters so you don't just have road closed stuff everywhere. Medway, there's a guy on some Facebook page who gets tweeted, and apparently their Medway Council emphasised that no intervention to aid cycling or walking will result in a reduction in carriageway space. Well, what's that about? I have heard that Medway have done some stuff that's kind of interesting, but they're also a bit into shared use. And their big development in Medway is going to be, they announced today, work on a programme of £170 million road, rail and quote environmental unquote projects. There you go, lots of car parking. Some people walking about there have just got out of their cars, no cyclists. Okay, that's Medway. Right, now it's a nice bit of work. We're in London now, nice bit of work by the Ranty Highwayman. On the left, you've got the Healthy Streets scorecard. These ones are the worst, these are the best ones. I've got some criticisms about how they do that scorecard, and it was done before COVID. But basically it's sort of, that's the crappiest, and that's the crappiest, that's the best, and those are the good ones, those are kind of medium. And on the other side, you've got from centre of London, a chart showing the percentage of adults classed as overweight and obese. And guess what? Bad old Havering is top there at 71% of adults. So there's all the fatties are there and tending to be more in outer London there and better in inner London there. So there is a link between healthier streets and people being obese. Who'd have thunk it? Okay there, Brent's about to start. I said that last week, I'm not sure what's going to happen. Wandsworth, Balham High Road cycle lane is in. And this photo, again, I'm quoting from the traders. Traders in Balham's Bedford Hills say business is booming in its vehicle-free zone. So that's the kind of thing you need to throw back at the naysayers. Here's Councillor Paul Convery in Islington saying nobody's going to be denied access to their street, but through traffic will no longer cut through back streets. Over 2/3 of that traffic is coming from outside Islington using our back streets as a shortcut to somewhere else. Lewisham AMPR cameras have gone in 4 locations to back up the low traffic neighbourhoods. So that's a good bit of news there. Okay, now this is important. Newham and Waltham Forest. Here, this little red line here, that is the boundary between Waltham Forest at the top and Newham at the bottom here. So this is the first cross-borough low traffic neighbourhood. You can do low traffic neighbourhoods. Linus Rees of Fitzrovia News has been calling for one in Fitzrovia, which would involve Westminster and Camden having to get together. It can be done. Newham and Waltham Forest have shown that it can be done, or it's in progress anyway. I've shown up the pop-ups on Prince of Wales Road in Camden. As of last Saturday, these footway extensions still haven't gone, and the new arrangement of bus stops still hasn't gone in. This slide I showed you 2 weeks ago, so come on, Camden. Enfield, there's a low traffic neighbourhood called the Bowes LTN, and the local LCC, I think, retweeted this from a guy's Facebook page. He runs a garden centre, and it's quite interesting to see how thoughtful he is. And he says, quite a few of my clients are going to be cut off for me and my truck full of gardeners. This could be a real pain, but then it can also prompt a shift in behaviour. All my gardeners are local and could cycle to jobs with a trailer. Could even give up on power tools and reduce pollution even further. There's problems with large supplies from removing waste, but there always are. I am fully up for adapting my company to take this route. I don't want my kids choking on my truck fumes. So that's a kind of nice bit of thoughtful analysis. And there's a Twitter thread of projects that Sustrans have been involved with in London. Okay, at the top, there's a LTN in Crystal Palace, in London Borough Croydon. I do wish we could not have so many of those things and have the nicer signs. And the campaign to keep Hammersmith Bridge closed to motors carries on. I mentioned this last time, showing some traffic aberration, and it is TfL official statistics, so you can quote that. And this Monday, they took a petition to the Department for Transport and other people. So that's good there. Right, better news from today. Richmond Park has been saying that it's going to cut out through traffic on some of the roads there, the green ones and the red ones, or only to car parks. And Through traffic will be on weekdays only there, and still through traffic on that blue there. Now, I've said, is that a glass 15% full or 85% empty? Because it's a little bit better than it was before the COVID lockdown, but it's not anything like as good as it was with the lockdown and with allowing cyclists in. And there are different reactions. Danny Williams has said he's in got mixed views. Simon Monk of LCC has said, oh, well, that's no good, it's terrible. People have said it's bloody awful, horrible. We just need to ban through traffic completely. You make your own minds up. How to talk to people about the future of their streets. Here is a interesting paper by LCC and Urban Movement. That's the reference there. There was about an hour and a half webinar you can go to there, which is worthwhile listening to for everybody who's in the whole community engagement business, which I hope most of you will be. There's your campaigns and reading again. This is new, actually. Transport for Quality of Life. I've got two new 2-pagers. I'll be reporting on them next week. Just saw them today. There's the Phil Goodwin paper about how the DFT ignores climate change in roads building decisions, and your consultations. Don't forget the one transport decarbonisation, one roads policing. Don't forget the Highway Code Review consultation document, and also the spending review. So get in there. And we've been discussing on Twitter Jeremy Vine. Now, he's said lots of really positive things about cycling. I think he's done a lot of good. He helped out with the Stay Wider the Rider program. He says sensible things. He's interviewed Cycling Mikey, who's got a lot of publicity for the right kind of ideas. However, a lot of people are upset that he can act as a bit of clickbait for some really foul anti-cycling tirades. It's the whole question of balance, what that is, how he can do it, what he could do to be better. And we've been having a lot of discussions about this because he's a good guy, but has he got himself to something which is getting the balance cited so that it's balancing around a fulcrum way too over to where the bigots and dangerous bigots are. And that brings us finally to another cartoon from the wonderful Dave Walker in fighting the anti-cyclists.
But yeah, let's talk about pavement parking. Well, I mean, I don't really have to explain to anybody on this call what the issue is, but like, there's a nice picture from Living Streets there showing that if we can't walk on the footway and we're trying to do walking networks, then we can't make a walking network. It's a massive issue. It's still an issue in London. I know like Clyde Lopes is always tweeting about the efforts they're having to stop the cars parking on the cycle tracks on Lea Bridge Road and the like. But outside of London, it's pretty much an epidemic, particularly in Greater Manchester. I've not seen anywhere as bad as that. It's like there's one car parked, the double parking. It's just nobody feels that they should leave their car on the road. It's almost like that kind of vibe that they feel they'd be obstructing other car users, or I don't know, they might be worried about the windscreen. Or I mean, I spoke to a few people about it in Greater Manchester, and there's like a little bit of while everybody else is parked on the footway, we feel we should as well. And interestingly, from a really perverse point of view, we're the only ones at my house that don't park a car in the middle of the footway. But twice in the last few months, a car sped down on the footway and nearly taken out one of my daughters. So there's that as well. They're stopping cars driving at 20 miles an hour down footways. There are some positives to these things, I should say. But frankly, we all think it's that something should be done about it. And but what can we do about it? So I've just quickly introduced the topic of what can we do now, and then Phil's going to tell us what we should really do. That's the way. So we could do some leaflets. We could hand some leaflets out. The pros, it's fairly inexpensive. We encourage good behaviour. Go, please, wouldn't mind. Or do you know that you're stopping someone in a wheelchair or someone with kids getting past there? That kind of like a nice positive messaging, nice and cheap. The kind of cons is that you can't guarantee any success. Will people be confident to walk down there or take their wheelchairs down there if it's usually going to be blocks? And it only takes one person to block to make a potentially dangerous situation. And some people might just out and out resist it. So there's that option, still an option. Marking bays, just going, look, why are you parked on the footway when there's a marked out bay just for you? We know all that space is just for drivers. Why don't you just do that? Like, encourage the compliance of it. Again, fairly low cost, but you do end up with a lot of line markings everywhere. And if we were to do this extensively across the UK or across areas, we would be bringing a lot of kind of maintenance concerns and issues of the sheer amount of white lining. And they still mightn't do it anyway. They still might feel there's some kind of risk. So we'll put all those white markings in and we'll still go on a footway because obviously that's where you park a car. But anyway, that's an option. Formalising the parking. Doing some build outs again, so like you can park your car in a place that feels a little bit more protected from through traffic. We could use that to bring in some extra trees. There's an example in Salford that I put in there. So again, make our streets a little bit tighter, a bit narrower to reduce speeds in there, formalise the parking, will they go on it? Well, again, it doesn't really guarantee that they'll comply, and it could be quite expensive to do all these build outs. One like the kind of real recommended urban one, the restricted parking zone. So basically you can only park in a marked bay, and then there's a PCN enforcement that can come in if you don't mark in a parked bay. Pretty good. And I would say in traffic signs manual, this is probably the most recommended one, and I've used them in the past, and we used to do lots of them around Camden, and I do absolutely swear by them. But again, it relies on the marked bays, so you're going to have to mark those out, and there's lots of signs, and that sign that I've shown on the left, the actual full size of it is huge, and you've got to have it at all the entrances to the restriction. And drivers, bless them, are getting a little bit confused with this of what does it mean if they don't see any kind of double yellows. It's just like clearly, oh, I'm good to park here. I can't see any signs. The signs were on the approaches, so there is a little bit of confusion. You might get that whole war against the motorist kind of who one in there, but it's still, you know, we should be doing lots more of these things. Frankly, it's an absolute essential. But the one that I like. Well, I like all of them, but I'm particularly attracted to this one at the moment as a kind of I'm a kind of engineer that likes a quick fix and then work on a kind of longer plan. But in the meantime, what can we get that's 90% there? A bit like Ollie was saying last week, that's kind of the rule of engineering. How do you get most of the way there, knowing that we'll never get perfection? So there's an order you can put in that basically says no parking or stopping on the footway at any time. They've been put in there. There's quite a lot around Milton Keynes, near where I live. Saw one in Wigan. And usually people do it to protect verges. And they normally do it to protect verges if cars go on it and it could slow other cars down. So like you create an issue on the carriageway. But for me, there doesn't seem to be any real reason why you can't use this to just keep cars off the footway. So you can pass an order through. The cons, like there's signs needed and there's quite a lot of signs to do, but you don't have to mark any bays. It's just putting that order through so we can do PCN enforcement. Hopefully regulations are changing over the next couple of years, but right now, what can we do and what could we roll out? This could be an approach, just a little bit more in the specifics of that. So this is something that I've been trying to promote people to look at around the country and the various people advice. So you've got that kind of entry sign, the one that says there. For me, that's very clear with the red line and like, don't do this kind of order. This is the clearest possible thing I think we can have. So you've got the start one, you've got the kind of end ones, but there's a few downsides. In traffic signs manual, kind of says these should be every, the post saying with this sign, should be every 30 metres. That's quite a lot of additional clutter to put on there. So, you know, a little bit of an annoying fix, but it does get the message over in a pretty clear way. What else did I want to say about it? So really, like for me, there's no reason why we can't use this. They're already used across the UK, and fundamentally, the point I want to make is if we took it seriously, we could do stuff right now. And lots of local authorities are saying, well, that's beyond our control to sort out footway parking. But some areas do it, even if they haven't got the bylaw that London have. And there are mechanisms to do it. We just need to start taking it seriously. And that's my quick intro. Apologies for the clumsy intro, Phil, but I've tried to set you up there. Phil, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Mother?
Good man. So I've given you an intro, Phil, but how do we do it properly? Forget enough of my bodgy engineering.
So yeah, thanks, Brian. So I'm going to talk about, or just give a quick outline as to what Wales intends to do about pavement parking. So many of you will have seen the 20 miles an hour task force report, which came out about 2-3 weeks ago now, and really pleased that the motion is approved by the Senate, overwhelming 44-5 to proceed with the legislation on 20 miles an hour, default 20, which is great. But I've also been chairing a second task force on pavement parking, like the first one appointed by Lee Waters, the Deputy Minister, great guy, ex-Sustrans. The task force has been made up of a wide range of organisations: the Welsh Local Government Association, local authorities, British Parking Association, Living Streets, Disability Wales, etc., etc. The report's written, but it hasn't been published yet, so I can't do a presentation. It's still held back, but I've shared the conclusions with a number of stakeholders, so felt I was happy to run through the main points, and then obviously if you've got questions, and perhaps say how this might apply to England, could be an area for discussion. I'd also stress these are the findings of the task force, and they're yet to be endorsed by Welsh Government or the Senedd, the Welsh Parliament. So the main role of the task force was to advise what can be done about pavement parking, rather than going into the problem itself. But we did quickly review the evidence of the problem, and as Brian said, London and Exeter's got a lot. Bob talked about Exeter. Exeter's also got a local law that says you can't park on the pavements, but my understanding is it's not very well enforced. But London, it's in the local legislation. There is an enforcement regime, and pavement parking is much better in London. But outside London, it's endemic, and it's just as much in Wales as the rest of the UK. Most people have a serious problem. Living Streets Wales did a survey a year or so back, and they found 83% of people said it was a common, large or very large problem. And that's clearly more so for some groups like the visually impaired, and people with children, people with buggies, that kind of thing. So the question for the task force is, okay, what are we going to do about it? How do we fix this? How do we empower somebody else to sort this out? So there were two approaches that were considered. One is basically repeating what's been done in Scotland, where Scotland has passed the Scottish Parliament has passed an active parliament, and they've created a wholly new offence of parking on the footway. It's also they've created an offence of double parking as well. So it's not related to any other law. It's there. It's a brand new offence, and the local authorities are given the power to enforce against that. And that's through primary legislation. Another way that we thought about doing it is there is an existing offence of obstruction. And the way that could be done is to enable civil enforcement, local authorities to enforce that existing offence of obstruction. And in fact, that's what's been recommended in England. The Transport Select Committee carried out an investigation into pavement parking. They reported in September 2019. And the Department of Transport actually wrote back and accepted the recommendations in March of 2020 and said, we will be consulting on bringing forward these measures in England. But that's where it's died. So that was just pre-COVID. Department of Transport perhaps had a lot on their plate, and nothing's been said since that I've seen that says what the Department of Transport is going to do to deliver on that commitment that they gave to the parliamentary committee. So in Wales, we've had the task force, and effectively we've chosen the English approach, gone for the second of those. And so if that's accepted, that will be Wales pressing on with something that DFT is also committed to. So effectively Wales will be effectively piloting this. And several of the task force members were very keen to see that happen, to see how that trail could be blazed in Wales. So why is that the preferred approach? Because there were some on the task force who were wary of that, felt it was a kind of weaker alternative. The view was that it's certainly much quicker to bring that forward through secondary legislation and still effective. Scotland actually started talking about pavement parking in 2010, went through a number of private members' bills. They finally became a government commitment 2 years ago, and it took them until November 2019 to pass the Act. But it's still not brought into operation because it's necessary to establish the exceptions where pavement parking will be allowed. There obviously are some situations, and I know that many people on this meeting would want to minimise them, but there are some situations perhaps where it's very difficult to find car parking spaces and the footway might be very wide, and there might be all kinds of reasons why actually on balance you allow a couple of wheels to pop on the pavement. Those would need to be given an exception in Scotland under the law before the Act could be commenced, and that will require regulations to bring them into place and statutory guidance. They're still not published as far as I'm aware, and local authorities have to go through all that process of marking these things out. So it's at least 2022 before this starts to happen in Scotland. So Wales said, well, we need to do something quicker than that. And the approach that we've taken is that pavement parking is already illegal. It's obstruction. The footway is for pedestrians. It's not lawful to drive on the footway. And if you park on the footway, because it is a place where vehicles should not go, that is prima facie causing obstruction. The problem is that that's a criminal offence, and only the police can enforce that criminal offence. And the burden of proof is considered to be very high. Or at least by some police forces, and it has been cited by some people that an actual obstruction needs to take place. If it actually requires someone to be walking along the pavement, the footway at that point, and then they can't proceed, and so the obstruction has happened. And there's also the word unnecessary is in the law, so that can cause concerns. And there's no recent case law on this because there's been very few recent cases that have gone to appeal. So it's just not working. The police aren't enforcing it, resources, all kinds of things. So the approach in Wales is to turn that into a contravention. So the Traffic Management Act already has lots of offences that were, well, formerly criminal offences are now parking contraventions, and they are enforced through civil enforcement. And so the trick is, or the mechanism is to just simply add that existing offence of obstruction to the list of contraventions that can be enforced through the Traffic Management Act. And the good thing about that is, well, a number of good things. One is that the local authority can do it and they get the income from the penalty charge notices, so it can be self-funding, and the burden of proof is lower. On a civil offence, and I'm not a lawyer on this, but this is the advice that we've had, it's the balance of probabilities. If the vehicle is parked on the footway, the balance of probabilities is causing an obstruction, and also the balance of probability is that it was driven on there. It wasn't dropped in by a crane, So it's a lot easier to do that. Now, there's a lot of detail still to work out. There will need to be an updating. There is already statutory guidance for the Traffic Management Act for civil enforcement of parking. That will need to be updated to tell authorities how that enforcement should be carried out, how much discretion they have. Do they carry out active enforcement, or do they enforce on complaints, etc., etc.? What do they do about discretion for loading and unloading? And all of that can come out in guidance, but it can be to some extent a bit more flexible. In Scotland, things like loading and unloading has had to be enshrined in legislation, so it took a long time to get that drafted. In Wales, it can be done through guidance that can be interpreted and developed through appeals, more easily updated in the light of those appeals. And those appeals will actually begin over time to establish case law. What is actually a reasonable? What is a reasonable? If there is no alternative and you have some overriding need to park to drop off something heavy or someone disabled, is that reasonable or not? All of that can be worked through appeals. As in Scotland, though, it will still, and in England, and Brian showed this, it will still be necessary in some places to mark areas of footway where parking is permitted, and that can be done as now through TROs. But one of the recommendations of the 20 miles an hour task force report was to do a simplification of the TRO process, removing the need for costly newspaper adverts, and if that helps, that will help to bring in that localised footway parking where it's needed and that can streamline the process and make the whole thing much more clear to drivers as well. But it's not just about enforcement. The main aim is to actually, prevent drivers from just thinking this is the right thing to do. Because I think there is a misplaced assumption, I think, amongst many drivers, that they're actually being polite to other drivers by leaving the carriageway clear. And they're not thinking about the poor people who can't walk down the footway, and they're thinking about a different set of road users. Maybe they're thinking about their own wing mirrors as well. But it's about educating the public and saying, well, don't do this, because look at all these people that are being, their lives are being made a misery by your thoughtless behaviour. And the fact that it's now backed by a more effective enforcement just gives some teeth to that behaviour change campaign. So in terms of the timescale, finally, the report expected in the autumn. It's all written, but I think there was a view that they didn't want to kind of run with 20 and pavement parking at the same time. So we hope it's going to come out in the autumn, and then a vote in the Senate, and hopefully they'll back it. Then second legislation, probably after the elections to the Welsh Parliament next year, and then aiming for implementation in summer 2022. So still a couple of years away, but I think a lot quicker than if the alternative, and certainly probably quicker than England, which seems to be about to embark on another round of consultation to decide how best to do this. So I haven't been watching the chat, but are there any questions on anyone want to? Brian,
I think there's been quite a good chat in there, Phil, but what it's like, it does seem like you got 2 years off. But yeah, how many years have we put up with this?
I know.
It is going to take a while to stamp out. There's 30 million cars being dropped all over the country. It's going to take a while to sweep them off the pavement and then sweep them out of our lives. That's the next one. But there is a somewhat clock on this thing. It
is difficult. So the delay thing, you've got to pass the legislation. You can't just overnight, just change the law. You've got to go through a process. There's a parliamentary timetable. You've got to prepare the law. It's got to go through you've got to be voted on, all the rest of it. And you can't produce the statutory guidance to local authorities to how to deliver on the legislation until the legislation is in place. So there is, unfortunately, there is a process to go through with these things. And then if it's about behaviour change, you've got to start to warm the public up to tell them why this law change is coming and why you've got to start to change your behaviour now. So these things do take time. I know we had similar criticisms with the 20 miles an hour, saying why can't it be done overnight? Well, the reality is it can't. And actually, a couple of years to change the law. It took us 2 years to get a new bit of guidance out on cycle infrastructure. To change the law is a bit harder. So it does take time, and it needs that political will. But I think it's very encouraging that it was so strong with the 20 miles an hour. I think if anything, pavement parking might be a bit more controversial than 20. So we'll see how the vote goes. But hopefully that's a good sign.
Okay, I'm going to ask Phil one more question and I'll open it up. But the extent to which you think Wales can drag England along with it on this?
Well, I think on 20 miles an hour, I think less so. There was a letter that came out from Grant Shapps quite recently. I don't know who saw it, but Councillor Wasim Zafar of Birmingham wrote to the Department of Transport and said, we'd like default 20 for Birmingham. We don't like putting all these 20 mile an hour signs up. We'd like to change the law in Birmingham so that it's 20 unless you see a sign telling you it's 30. And Grant Shapps wrote back saying, well, we can't do that just for Birmingham, which I think is probably reasonable. And then he said it's going to, it's going to cost a lot of money for enforcement and all the rest of it, and it's just not practical. So I think on 20 miles an hour, England set its face against that, and that might take a bit longer. But pavement parking, I think England seems to be saying, yes, we accept the recommendations of the Transport Committee, and they're essentially the same as Wales is going to do. So I think it might help that it does knock out some of the wrinkles. Producing the statutory guidance is going to be really hard. Getting that right balance between enforcement and resources and certainty and all of that, it's going to be a very, very difficult thing to do. I think the devil's going to be in the detail on that. But once Wales has done that, if it begins to work well, then I think it makes life much easier for England to pick it up and run with it.
That's great. Has anybody got any other questions for Phil? I've been hogging him.
Yeah, well, it's partly for Phil, it's partly for you or Dave or anybody. that the West Midlands Police Road Harm Prevention Team have been doing some kinds of enforcement. I don't know, wonder what section of RTA 1988, but they've definitely had police officers doing some forms of enforcement.
Yeah, can I come in on?
Yes. Yeah, go on, Dave.
Yeah, well, they've been using exactly the sort of things I've been just putting on the chat there. And additionally, one I actually did a private with, I've mentioned Section 28. This is not the Section 28 you think it is. Section 28 of the Town Police Clauses Act 1847 is about obstructing footways.
Yeah.
For me, it was the fact that you've got to have a clearance of 8 feet above the footway for all awnings and stuff. Because I clobbered my head on a bus stop and I threatened to sue them under Section 28, and promptly all the bus stops in Inverness shot up by 2 feet. But it also applies to putting anything on the footway to obstruct it. So we've got Section 28. In London, the TfL traffic enforcement officers have the powers to enforce Section 72, which is driving a carriage on a footway. Section 72, the Highways Act 1835. And they've largely enforced it on the Tower Bridge closure where they were finding cyclists, but they can actually find motorists as well. And they can also enforce Section 137, which is the one that Bill was mentioning, obstruction of traffic. And I've seen signs put up, I think it was in the Birmingham area on a road, that people will be prosecuted for obstruction under Section 137. So there's lots of ways we can do it. But GLA members are not going to back this. You know, I spoke to the traffic officers. We can enforce these things, but the GLA members are not going to back us on it. You know, and Phil's quite right. The secondary legislation is the way forward. And also, we've got the roads policing. We've been very successful in getting bad driving prosecuted, but equally, can we not use photographs of bad parking to actually get better processed? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that London's always different. And you were talking about enforcement officers. I'm actually talking specifically about police officers who could enforce forms of, but, you know, presumably at the moment, they're only doing really bad ones that are really sort of very obviously obstructing probably not only just the footway, but also the carriageway as well. So, but I mean, thanks for your input, but you know, I'm talking specifically about that policing thing.
Yeah, and you're quite right, the police do enforce it, but yeah, you're also quite right that they just do the odd one, and doing it en masse when it's all gone to rack and ruin there. So maybe it's like a proper public information.
Yeah.
Like, and it, during the, I was trying to push it during the start of the crisis. Going, well, this is a good time to get public information over. Let's say get off there, particularly with social distancing. We need all the footways. Can everybody shift their cars out, the one that they're going to leave for the next couple of months because they're sat in the house? That would have been a really great time to just see if people could behave somewhat. But yeah,
I come back there, Brian. I've been tweeting a little bit. I installed some retention curb, HGV retention curb. It's a Charcon product to stop HGV drivers from demolishing a wall onto a cycle route on the railway line below a bridge. That's been in 20 years and it's been pretty effective. There are parts of the footway where you will need a standard 6-inch curve to be able to step off, or a drop curve to be able to roll off. But we have so many people killed, so much damage and serious injuries by drivers leaving the carriageway and going onto the footway. Are there not places where we could actually install, instead of pedestrian guard railing, some of this deflection curb that's designed to put vehicles back into the carriageway?
Yeah, I mean, there were places that have used Triaf curbs in Camden before when I know I've got a bend, and like, what else would you, I mean, all depends on the context and where you're doing it, and like, what's it going to make the street look and feel like, and how will people get across? So there's implications too, but yeah, that's a button I've pressed myself in the past, so I'm certainly not going to say no to it.
Well,
that, Phil?
Yeah, I think that's the thought. It's endemic, so I think you can tackle kind of hotspots with planters and bollards and all kinds of things. You can physically prevent vehicles getting on the pavement, but you can't do that over. I think Wales has got 30,000 kilometres of road, you know, so we at it for centuries. So it has to be done another way, I think. Somebody put on the chat about private members bill. That wouldn't make things any quicker. I mean, if the legislation goes through, the legislation will happen less than a year from now. Or no, probably about a year from now. You know, once the Parliament gets it voted in May, because I think there's no time left in this parliamentary session. You've got a new Parliament in May, then they can just crack on and get the secondary legislation passed. It's not that, it's then all the time taken to do the education, to do the guidance, to get the resources, all of that. You know, it does take time to build up the resources that are needed to get the policies in place about how they're going to enforce, how they're going to respond to complaints, that kind of thing. Which areas you're going to target you've got a whole set of limited resources. Where are your hotspots? How are you going to decide what your hotspots are? So there's a lot of planning, a lot of thinking to do. But I think, you know, so I genuinely think that 2 years or so is pretty quick, actually. I think if this is going to happen.
What about that idea, Phil, about like, because the police are taking a lot more camera evidence. If you took a picture, there's the person, the thing, send it off to the police. Could they?
Yeah, well, you could
Would
do
the fear
that.
be enough to stop them doing it?
I bet effectively, yeah. I mean, you've got to have the whole back office system, because you know that's what civil enforcement is set up to do. So civil enforcement officers, or sorry, civil parking CPE, civil parking enforcement officers, they walk around with handheld computers. You know, they take the details, it prints out the ticket, they slap the ticket on, it all goes back to back office. What, 10 days later, if they haven't paid, they get a reminder through the post. It's a very slick and automated operation for enforcing existing TROs. All we're saying is just extend that whole mechanism, that whole kind of infrastructure to another contravention. So I think it's all there. You know, it's just there, and really, they just need the power to do it, basically. And all of the mechanisms are in place. We don't need to invent a whole new kind of system, which is kind of how Scotland's gone about. And whatever reason they've done that, that's fine, you know. But Scotland's invented a whole new offence and a whole new set of statutory guidance, and even the markings are going to, you know. So the process of defining an exception to the pavement parking ban is not a traffic regulation order. It's going to be some other kind of process that they've. It seems they've kind of made it a little more difficult than maybe they need to have done. But yeah.
I had a different legal question, if that's all right.
Sure.
That two different sets of people I vaguely know in two different parts of the country have been looking at legal challenge around pavement parking in England relating to the Equalities Act, particularly. And I wondered if you'd looked at that or thought about how that could push government on, or if it could. And they're looking at it in terms of street clutter generally and pavement clutter that is particularly restrictive if you have any sort of movement disability or visual disability.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think equalities issues are absolutely the key to this. You know, yeah, and because I think, as I said, the problem of pavement park is bad enough for sighted people, for example, or people with reasonable mobility. If you've got limited sight or no sight or limited mobility, it's even worse. So absolutely get that. In a sense, the use of the Equalities Act would be to push government to do something. The government is already doing something. You know, they've already instructed the task force. They've already committed to this. That they've received our report, and I think in due course we'll be recommending to the Parliament that it's endorsed, and hopefully. So I think it's kind of happening anyway. So because I think the Equalities Act wouldn't be a useful tool, because what you've got to do is you're not changing local authorities or government. You've got to change the behaviour of drivers, and you can't use the Equalities Act to change the behaviour of drivers. They're going to just respond to a ticket and enforcement, you know. So that's what we need to put in place. So I think in a way we're kind of past that in Wales. I think they've already decided to do that, and they're doing it as fast as they can. So yeah, I think we've kind of moved on beyond it. But I mean, it's absolutely right. It's certainly an equalities point. Yeah.
So I've just been checking out the chat. I think it's worth unpacking this a little bit more. Like people promoting more of a kind of nudging approach. I kind of was a little bit dismissive on your intro because I wanted to run through the options quickly to get there. But I know it's something that Chris Borden said to me in the past. Well, let's just tell people what we're doing. Let's, put the stickers on by the kids. Like, how are we supposed to pass it? Come on, think about this. And someone suggested like a sign. Everybody here parks on the carriageway. Please do the same. All kind of nudging stuff. There's lots of good behavioural economics. So I don't know whether you have a take on that, Phil. What we do while we're waiting for you to change all the laws for us.
Well, and that can start now. So I think that once I think the key to this is getting the vote. Once the government is committed once the Parliament in Wales is committed to doing this, and hopefully that'll be this year, all of that can start, because then you can say to the public, look, the law hasn't changed yet, but it's coming in 2 years' time. So let's start to do the right thing now. One of the things that they're very proud of in Wales is this sort of sense of community, whether it's real or not, or whether they believe that about themselves. But they do, it is a kind of trait of the Welsh kind of psyche that they believe that they have a stronger sense of community than maybe other parts of the UK. So if you can tell the Welsh people that's true about themselves, and therefore to do the right thing this is what you should do. This is the right thing. Doing the right thing is not being kind to other drivers by keeping out the way. Doing the right thing is keeping out the way of pedestrians. So yeah, all of that behaviour change can start and should start. And if you look at the 20 mile an hour report, if anybody has had time to look at that, the process is very similar. So we've talked about a behaviour change campaign that will start pre-legislation, and that will be the same with pavement parking. So they don't have to wait for each other. So you actually do the public information to begin to change behaviour, but also to bolster the view of politicians that this is they should commit to this. So it helps to get the politicians to finally vote the thing through, and for local authorities to get the right policies in place to promote it. So hopefully by the time it comes to actually being implemented, you've built in that community support that everyone recognises. Yeah, you know what, this is the right thing to do. So that's a really, really strong element to how this will be rolled out.
Do you think there'd be I hate to say the word now, but any kind of referendum element of across the nation required? Maybe this is a way for getting English towns to do it. Like, should we all park on the footway? Yes.
For the 20 mile an hour campaign, which there was a separate report produced by the Wales Centre for Public Policy, which is a fantastic report. If you want to read about behaviour change, there's a fantastic report that came out at the same time as the task force report on 20 miles an hour, and it talks about how to construct a behaviour change campaign around 20 miles an hour, and it's really good, and it just talks about all those messages. So I think that kind of thinking hasn't been applied yet to pavement parking, but it is absolutely all of that thinking about using nudge, using psychology, to kind of get those messages across. Yeah, very much so.
And there was another thing that came up which I was like jumped all over and stomped on, but bollards, which is kind of like the people that care put bollards all the way along the sides of footways, and maybe that's an extent to protect the maintenance and stop people cracking all your paving slabs as well if you're doing nice material. But what's your take on bollards, Phil?
It's the same as TRIF curves, isn't it? You can't, say there's 30,000 miles of roads in Wales, or kilometres, I can't remember which. You can't put bollards everywhere, and I think you've got to begin to change the presumption that pavements are for parking, and that's ultimately what it's about. You just begin to change that social norm. It's the same with 20. It's about saying, you know what, 30 is too fast to drive. You know what, you shouldn't park on the pavement, and if you do, there's a chance you'll get a ticket. So I think that's more powerful and ultimately a cheaper way of doing it, because and less clutter and less effect on narrowing effect. Because if you put bollards down, they're going to be usually 300-400 mil from the edge of the curb. You've narrowed your footway by 0.5 metre. well, we don't want to do that either, do we? Because otherwise you might as well have the car parking half a metre on. You know, we're kind of just replacing the car with a bollard. So it doesn't seem to me to be the right solution ultimately.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I often say like the law's the best agent of behaviour change. So once you start that process, I think that's the key, and certainly like the select committee starting the process of looking at it as England, it's made everybody start taking it seriously again, that there's potentially a legal change come. So that's enough for you to start doing something locally. Go, look, we're looking at changing the law here. Should we get in line right now with it?